Well, this is one very big issue here on the continent that a lot of people are concerned about, and it's something that has to do with the innocence of an African child. Call it child abuse, but the thing is getting rampant by the day. And the most interesting or shocking aspect of it is that these people are people known to the family, known to the child. We're talking about non-strangers who abuse that precious gift. That's our focus today on VSA. Welcome, I'm Sulaiman. Well, child abuse is rampant on the continent, with every nation on the continent having to deal with its disturbing presence. Now, many countries are yet to rise to the responsibility of protecting their children, their future, from the clutches of wicked men and women who inflict eternal psychological and sometimes physical damage on these children. In Africa, there's trafficking, violence, and kidnapping of children to work in baby factories, giving birth against their will and exposed to terrible conditions. 1 in 3 child victims of sexual exploitation on the continent tells no one. They fear disbelief, the blame that trails their revelation, public shame, and when they are boys, there are almost no laws protecting them. Child abuse is a silent emergency in Africa. Well, hardly discussed, but important to the future of the continent. Now, when more than 30% of girls on the continent say their first sexual encounter had been rape or assault, then there is a need to seek solutions, prevention, and ask to know when to seek help. Now, in Village Square Africa today, we have 3 passionate women and a gentleman looking at child protection. Anne Ireri, Executive Director of International Federation of Women Lawyers, that's FIDA in Kenya, and Yvonne Benzi Idahosa, Founder and Executive Director, Pathfinders Justice Initiative, an NGO working against sexual violence against women and girls in Nigeria. And pretty much later, we will have Dr. Dialens Noble. He's a medical practitioner and founder, Saving Women and Children Foundation. Aminata Koroma, Secretary, Forum Against Harmful Practices, Sierra Leone. She also will be joining me on the other half of the show. Well, ladies, good to have you here. It's something really disturbing, more so. I think, Yvonne, you've been following what's been happening in Nigeria, a case in point of a celebrity who is in the eye of the storm. Whoever these people are, that's why we're discussing this. Let me start, with Yvonne quickly here. What do you make of the rise in sexual assault in Nigeria and even other parts of the continent?
Thank you so much for having me on once again. I think it's important that we note that sexual abuse of children and rape of children is something that is both endemic and an epidemic in Nigeria. But it's been this way for quite some time. I think the recent rise in the use of social media is something that has amplified the reality of the day-to-day reality that young women and girls, particularly young girls under the age of 18, are having to deal with. And so this is something that has been happening for quite some time. 1 in every 3 girls is a victim of a sexual assault before she's 18. 1 in every 10 boys. And the reality is that most of these young girls who are subject to sexual assault, this reality happens to them before the age of 15. And so I think it's unfortunate, obviously, that we're dealing with a society that is not just neutral on the subject of rape and child sex abuse. It's actually intentional in systemically silencing the voices of women and girls and dealing with the issues that have to do with women and girls. And so as a result of that, you see the abysmal conviction rate that we're currently dealing with in Nigeria.
Well, let me bring in on, listening to Yvonne, we know that this has gone beyond Nigeria. It is in Kenya, it is in South Africa, it is in Namibia, it is in Ghana. And the thing, is that there must be a kind of legislation to also help. Because, for instance, in Nigeria, time was when the courts were on strike and everyone you know, it's amazing how people wanted the accused, to be let out because the courts were on strike. So how grave is this issue we're talking about, abuse of a child, especially when it has to do with sexual abuse?
Thank you very much, Suleiman, for having me. As Yvonne has said, two things do stand out. One, that child abuse is endemic, but it is an epidemic within Africa. And we must continuously remind ourselves as people on the African continent that one, we have international standards that our governments have subscribed to. We are looking at the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is not even as elaborate as the African Charter on the Welfare and the Rights of the Child, which went further to consider the exceptional circumstances that an African child is likely to find themselves in. However, what we have seen, especially in the case of a lot of our countries, is that COVID has brought out the shadow epidemic or pandemic, as a lot of the scholars are referring to, in terms of child protection, in terms of abuse that children have been exposed to. We have seen, one, increasingly that families are forced to spend much more time together behind closed doors, but also the overarching challenges that have come with the COVID pandemic, be it within families, be it within parents. Really, at the end of the day, the punch bags have been the children. And so as a continent, we must start asking ourselves, if we have laws that we subscribe to, that numerous have been domesticated within our different countries in form of national legislation, what then is going wrong? Why are we not able to effectively prevent and control child abuse from happening? And I think for us, Suleiman, that's a major question within the context of Kenya and within the larger East African region that we are seeking to look at and find answers well within this pandemic. Thank you.
Well, my next question is for both of you, but since I'd like to start with, Anne, I'll come back to Yvonne, and it has to do with your experiences so far in what you're doing at the moment, because listening to both of you will help Africans understand the gravity of what we're dealing with. And for instance, you were awarded for the 160 Girls Project in 2017 and 2019. Perhaps you want to share the hard facts you have discovered since you embarked on this journey.
Thank you very much, Suleiman. So the story of 160 girls in Kenya, which was a landmark case that was heralded globally, is really putting the duty bearer, in this case, the police service, as the key gatekeepers of enforcement of the law towards child protection. So the situation in Kenya is that we had the 2010 constitution that has been really praised and heralded as being very progressive, especially on child protection. The Constitution of Kenya does acknowledge that children are a special group that need protection and care by the state. And so we had all this enabling legislation, one that protects children, but secondly, that articulates the duties and the responsibilities of the National Police Service in terms of investigation of the cases that occur within abuse. So in a nutshell, what we were seeking to have when we went for the constitutional petition is firm interpretation of what the duty of the state is insofar as investigation and prosecution of perpetrators, especially on sexual abuse, are concerned. Bearing in mind that in a lot of our contexts, the duty or the purpose of law is one, of course, to protect those who are under that particular legislation, in this case, children, but secondly, to act as a deterrent factor. Where we have successful prosecution of perpetrators by the state, then whoever would have thoughts or harbor thoughts of harming children would be dutifully warned. And so the 160 Girls case was really an affirmation that the state has primary duty to protect children in the first instance from abuse, but where abuse or violations do occur, they actually are vicariously liable or have a greater responsibility to ensure proper investigations are carried out that would then ensure that the perpetrators are brought to book. So that's really the story behind the 160 Girls, which has been landmark in terms of overhauling how the National Police Service in Kenya view their duty of investigating claims of child sexual abuse.
Well, Yvonne, I think some Nigerians are aware of your work, especially those in southern part of Nigeria. Edo State specifically. Tell us, if you will, some of those key things you've been able to uncover away from, sexual, slavery. Plus, does this also involve children, young children below the ages of 18 and 20 who are being trafficked and exploited?
I mean, absolutely. I think what we see is that child sex abuse cuts across every demographic, every class. There's really nobody that is potentially on the end of not becoming a victim. And I think, particularly in Nigeria, the reality is that, as Anne was alluding to, we have laws on the books. Implementation is the real issue that we're dealing with. The reality is that when you, as a victim of sexual abuse, go to a police station and try to report a case, you're dealing with so many obstacles. Initially, you have to, find the funding to be even able to mobilize the police to even start the case. You're dealing with a system of people that don't even believe that young women particularly should have access to justice. And so there are all these roadblocks in the way of even trying to get a case prosecuted. You're asked all sorts of questions about, what were you doing there? Victim blaming, victim shaming. Why didn't you run? What were you wearing? The cases take 2 to 3, sometimes even 4 or 5 years to prosecute because we do not have any specialized rape courts in Nigeria. You hear cases like this being referred to as family matters, when children as young as a year old are being molested with incest or with family members that we know should not be doing these sorts of behaviors. And so I think realistically what we're dealing with in Nigeria is a culture that has accepted the reality that it's okay to actually blame the victim, to be able to take the blame off the adult who has caused this crime, and allow the victim to have to carry the burden of the mental, physical, and psychological abuse that can last a lifetime. Because the reality of what we're dealing with in Nigeria is that less than 5% of victims, considering that we have 1 in every 3 girls, 1 in every 10 boys, will actually ever get the help that they need. And so what we're seeing is adults walking around with depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, with suicidal ideations, who are supposed to be functional in society. And when you have that larger percentage of people who have not yet had an opportunity to resolve the issue, have not even had an opportunity to have their experience validated in Nigeria, you're not going to have a functional society at all. And so those are some of the things that we're seeing that are happening within the context of Nigeria. Certainly, we do have some laws in place, but implementation is the issue. The lack of consistency with sentencing is a big problem. We know that the reality is that it's the certainty of conviction that serves as a deterrent. It's not necessarily the severity of what the crime supposedly is on the books. And so I think collectively, all of us have to take a stance of repudiating this idea that women particularly are to blame for when these sorts of incidents occur.
Let me comment here quickly, because you've just touched on a very important aspect which we've seen even on social media, and some columnists, people, shifting the blame, to the victim. And I don't know if this also obtains in Kenya. And good thing you're a lawyer. Are the laws for child protection explicit enough? And in cases of justice, do many children get justice?
Thank you. Increasingly, as Evan has said, we are seeing within our societies that the burden of sexual abuse shifts to the victim. In our case, legally, we do have sufficient laws. If you look at our constitution within Kenya, as well as enabling legislation such as the Sexual Offences Act, which really carries harsh minimum mandatory sentencing that is very, very crucial. However, what we are seeing in the case of Kenya and a lot of African contexts is that, for instance, we did inherit an adversarial system from the colonial regime, which then tends to focus more on accused persons, where we're looking at reprieves such as bail and bond, vis-a-vis protecting especially child victims, where we should be having more child-friendly courts, where we should be having a child does not have to be re-victimized 3 or 4 times by stating or narrating the same set of facts before a police officer. Then they have to come to court and still narrate the same story. So we are seeing a trend where holistically the legal system has not grown and evolved sufficiently to have enough measures that protect child victims, where they can have, for instance, video evidence, and they give this evidence once to a child psychologist or a police station, and they do not have to come to court physically and most likely even face the perpetrator, where we know intimidation occurs. So for a lot of lawyers, the frustrations happens in court, and we should also have fast-tracking mechanisms within our different contexts that allow children not to keep on coming to court to give the same kind of evidence, but they give evidence once, the cases are fast-tracked, and they can go back to normal life. What we need to emphasize is that child abuse never leaves a child the same. And we are seeing a lot of long-term systemic effects, especially on children who are abused when they are young, and they then become dysfunctional parents, and chances of the children also facing abuse are very high. So this means that holistically we are looking at a society that's in danger unless we have firm mechanisms that protect child victims of abuse, away from reporting, away from them being processed in the criminal justice system, to them facing the sentencing that a perpetrator would have to go through. However, emphasis also needs to be on prevention. Remember, it's always easier to and better to prevent than to cure. So we must put children at the forefront of the fight. We have to encourage healthy dialogue amongst our teenagers so that they're able to spot and highlight instances of abuse, and have, whether it's caregivers such as teachers, health personnel, properly trained so that they are able to spot and identify abuse immediately it occurs, and they aid the children and destigmatize the entire issue of reporting, especially child sexual abuse.
And I'm happy, I think you've moved it to the area where we should be going to at the moment, talking about how to spot, how to recognize. I'm happy that both of you experts, you've been able to interact with victims across the continent. From experience, Yvonne, help us here. What are the noticeable signs one can discover from a victim of abuse?
Well, generally, I think that they fall into about 4 categories. I mean, you've got physical signs, mental signs, emotional signs, and what I refer to as reenacting signs. When it comes to physical abuse, what we're looking at are, a soreness or bruising on the genitals of a child. Are you noticing a foul smell or a discharge? Is there vaginal or anal bleeding? I don't mean to be so crass, but it's so important that we're using the correct terminology.
Absolutely.
When we're talking about
Absolutely.
These sorts of things. Is a child complaining about pain during urination? Are they having pain in their bowel movements? When we're talking about mental signs, it's important that we're looking for self-harm, right? So a child that was normally pretty balanced is suddenly now engaging in self-harming behavior, such as cutting themselves or burning themselves. Are they talking about suicide? Do they suddenly have an unexplained fear of a particular person, right? Or a particular place? Are they having nightmares out of nowhere? Do they suddenly have sleeping problems? When we talk about emotional signs, we're talking about personality changes. A child who was doing very well in school is suddenly displaying signs of anger and or is very clingy, to their mother all of a sudden. Are they having mood swings or depression? Are they having eating disorders? These are all the manifestations of potential child sex abuse. And then when it comes to reenacting, you see sometimes children who've been abused tending to abuse other children, right? So reenacting what has happened to them on other young children, or the use of even some of their toys, right? Inserting them into their anus or their vaginas. And so I think these are signs, and obviously not one single aspect of this means that this is certainly 100% happening to your child, but these are things I think that parents, particularly in a context in Africa where we tend to allow our children to stay with relatives or with grandparents or with our house help for extended periods of time because of this level of community and trust. These are signs that parents particularly need to be looking out for.
Well, Anne, you just might want to add to that.
Yes, I think Yvonne has painted a clear picture. She is right in terms of the signs that we see. What I think is important to accompany that is sufficient advocacy, especially for the primary caregivers, because a lot of the signs are first identified, whether it's by guardians, by parents, by nannies or teachers who really spend sufficient time with these children or substantive time with the children. So we need to empower them so that once they note these signs, they have mechanisms to raise the flag or to whistleblow quite early, and then they are able to have channels where they can process this information. Key aspects such as evidence preservation are very important, so that how do fast responders need to carry out their intervention so that at the end of the day you don't have evidence that's crucial being watered down or being destroyed inadvertently because probably they're trying to move on with day-to-day routines. So information about how to be first responders and to still keep a sufficient protection or custody of the evidence chain is important, so that at the end of the day, we do need to remember that there is an entire justice system or an entire justice chain that needs to be followed through, so that we don't have cases, for instance, not seeing the light of day simply because the evidence was not sufficient or there was not good preservation of this evidence. Secondly, is to reiterate, especially within our African context, the need for psychosocial support, that we need to destigmatize the need for counseling, the need for psychological intervention, because this child really needs this at that first instance, and also the caregiver. So we need to really destigmatize the approach or the need for psychosocial help within our African context, within our setup, so that it accompanies the medical intervention that a lot of these children would have to face, bearing in mind for most of them, not all, life never goes back to be the same. Most of them are nursing physical, emotional, life-changing wounds that will really never go away. So we need to invest continuously in supporting these children, even beyond the court process, so that they're able to have a way or a sense of reintegration and going back to a sense of normalcy, though underscoring the reality that life never goes back to being the same.
Yvonne, quickly here, some of the categories of children that have been so abused are those, living with disabilities. And is there anything your organization, for instance, is doing to help these, special children get justice?
Well, I think it's a matter of working on the issue holistically, right? So, what makes children who have disabilities even more vulnerable is that realistically their voices are stifled in some ways, right? They may not necessarily have the skills or the tools to actually be able to do the necessary reporting, and so that's why I think it's so important that prevention efforts are wide scale, right? So we're conducting outreaches, attempting to get young people to understand that even with disabilities, there are actually things that the parents or the caregivers can put in place to protect those children. Some of the things I mentioned earlier, but I think it's also important that we're talking about the role of men and boys, particularly when it comes to the abuse of young women, ensuring that the focus and the pressure is not necessarily on the young women to protect themselves, or even with the children with disabilities to protect themselves, but really trying to transform the way that society has adopted this mindset of entitlement to the bodies of other people, of women and girls in particular, right? This sense that you can objectify a human being and society actually be okay with that. We see that written in our laws, it's in our customs, it's in our religions in many ways, right? And so that's really the area of focus that we are trying to work on, not focusing necessarily on the potential victim, but working with the entire society as a whole to say, look, we need to be preventing these issues. We need to be talking to people who are in positions of influence and power, right? So our church leaders, particularly people, our traditional rulers, for example, people who have influence and can use their voices to address some of these societal ills, right? And so for us, I think it's important that we're looking holistically at the issue and not just, at pockets of what could potentially change, but ensuring that the entire mindset that deals with patriarchy, that then trickles down to the rest of society is actually addressed.
Well, and let me come to you, and it has to do with some of the perpetrators across the continent. Sometimes these are very powerful people, very influential people in society. And of course, how does anyone start to, deal with the challenge of that kind of battle with these people, bearing the dangers they possess in mind?
Thank you very much. I think what we need to reiterate is the application of the law. So we need to have consistency, as has been mentioned, and the more we have tough penalties, sentencing that the law outlines, regardless of your status in society, then we have more people being aware that it does not matter what status you have in society. If you commit any of these crimes, you're going to face the full force of the law. So consistency is important. And for those of us who are in spaces where we can raise our voices, making sure that we continuously clamor, agitate for equality in terms of application of the law, and where we can have a sufficient protection of the children, then that way the voices will be heard. And I think within the African continent, we've seen tremendous growth, especially within the women's movement. Young women in particular have come out quite vocal in terms of their body autonomy, as everyone has mentioned. So we need to continuously support these initiatives, make sure that regardless of their ages, especially for the young women who cut across different diversity, whether they're living with disability, marginalized or minority women who are still part and parcel of our society, have a voice, and that voice cuts across. And for those of us in positions where we can influence and lobby and even call out perpetrators who are in high society, we should do that with the full force and being able to collectively support each other towards this goal.
Let's start winding down on this first half. Yvonne, tell us, now you should be able to speak to the parents. I'll come back to Anne to talk to the legislators. What are those key things? How can parents or guardians help, that boy or girl suffering from the psychological effects of such abuse?
Well, I think just very briefly, I think there's a few things that prevention-wise, I think that parents need to ensure are in place. I mean, first and foremost, I think, is just teaching your children the concept of bodily autonomy. The fact that you have the power to control your body, right? We see this happening in the African context a lot, where you see a child that's hesitant to hug an uncle, but yet we're pushing the child. No, go hug uncle, whoever. Parents should be teaching their children about bodily autonomy. They should also be teaching their children about boundaries, right? And the idea that people can't cross certain lines, describing body parts with the actual words, vagina and penis, as opposed to calling it, pet names or different things that could potentially be confusing for the child. It's also important that you're creating an enabling environment, particularly for a child who has already been abused, so that that child can actually come to you and be able to talk about the reality of what they've experienced. In our context in Africa, you tend to see, even within the family where there's a situation of abuse, a child being told not to discuss it, not to raise it. That's the absolute worst thing that you can do, because then you're forcing that child to go into silence and to deal with the issue on their own, when we know that the reality is that this shows up in the future in your relationships. You see children acting out in many ways, or being promiscuous, or having to deal with situations where even in their marital relationship, they're having issues with their sexual relationship. And so I think it's so important that parents particularly are creating an enabling environment, but also actively seeking counseling for their children. Like I mentioned, less than 5% of victims or survivors in Nigeria actually will ever get support. We need to stop stigmatizing the idea that people need mental health support, and making sure that anyone who has actually been victimized has access to a mental health counselor, so that they can deal with some of these issues and avoid some of the complications that I mentioned earlier, such as depression and post-traumatic stress disorder.
Well, and quickly here for us, what more can legislation do to help in the continent, protect our children?
I think for me, I'm yet to come across any society, especially within Africa, that does not value and see the need to protect the children. And so because we have collectively agreed and we subscribe to this good that children are special within our societies, then for legislators who represent the will and the voice of the people is to call upon them to fulfill their twofold mandate. One, to enable the prevention of violence against children by having sufficient legislation that can stand the test of time, legislation that is well thought out, and legislation that is effective to ensure that deterrence is achieved. And secondly, that we have good legislation that respond in the event that violence does take place. How will they be able to hold, for instance, law enforcement to account, the different child protection mechanisms within the society? So we need to be able to see legislators fully fulfilling the mandate within the context of child protection, where they appraise the different sets of legislation we have within the continent to ensure that they're sufficiently taking care of children. So that's very important.
Well, many thanks, Anne Ireri and Yvonne Benson in Idahosa. Many thanks for speaking with us on this very important talk today.
Thank you.
Well, coming up,
Thank you, my pleasure.
Dr. Noble and Aminata Koroma joins me after now to talk more on this very important issue of child abuse and how best to get this out of the continent. We'll continue our talk here on Village Square Africa, looking at children. Child abuse cuts across really from commercial sex exploitation to trafficking, child labor, and many more. And nations don't estimate the economic impacts of this malady on the countries. Now, children who have been abused in the past have no identifiable injuries, clear proofs making their cases more difficult to prosecute legally. Now, there is disturbing, considering that many perpetrators walk freely in the absence of implicating and undeniable evidence, making other children prone to being victimized by them. Now, good parenting, more than ever, is an essential need in thwarting and averting child molestation, assault, and abuse. Now, Dr. D. Allens Noble, medical practitioner and founder of Saving Women and Children Foundation, and Aminata Koroma, Secretary Forum Against Harmful Practices, Sierra Leone. Welcome to VSA.
Good evening, Suleiman.
Well, good to know that you've been able to get that connection up and running. Good to see you, and many thanks for joining us. Quickly, Dr. Noble, what are the medical or pathological signs of an abused child or victim of sexual assault?
Thank you, Suleiman. Sadly, regarding sexual assault and other forms of physical assault, usually we don't have any medical testing to actually pinpoint to a child being assaulted. However, there are some physical signs that we may see in a sexually assaulted child. One of them will include trauma to the genital areas or to the anal region, bleeding from those areas, maybe the genital or the anal region. Then for children who are old enough to speak, they can tell you, ma or dad or mom, this person assaulted me or this person touched me in this particular way. Because if a child is telling you that, best believe the child is saying the right thing. That is for some of the medical parts. Then you could also see cases of black eyes. You could see black eyes, this discoloration around the eyes. Maybe it could be from forced intercourse or molestation. So I don't want to narrow it down to the sexual part because most times when I counsel parents and guardians, child abuse cuts across sexual abuse. There's physical abuse, there's emotional abuse, there's neglect, and there is the sexual abuse. For the neglect, you see children who are not provided with adequate food. You see them really underweight. You see them eating from the trash can. They are begging for food. They are stealing food. That is for the neglect part. Then for the physical abuse, that is the one I was talking about, which is kind of related to the sexual abuse. You hear things of unexplained injuries, bite marks. You're seeing various bones broken. You're seeing cases of bruising in areas they shouldn't be bruising. Children of young age, when they bruise, there are places we expect them to bruise. So once you're seeing a child that is coming with a bruise in an unexplained position or an unexplained area of the body, it causes a red flag. So we should look into that. Then for sexual abuse, let's narrow it down to sexual abuse. It just doesn't stop, or it doesn't just end with sex. It's not just sex. It can be the actual touching. It can be the actual touching of the parts on the child. It could be exposing yourself to the child. It could be fondling with the child. It could be making the child fondle with certain parts of the body. So it doesn't just narrow down or streamline down to sexual intercourse. Anything or any form of activity that makes this child vulnerable, that can be regarded as a sexual abuse. And sexual abuse has a lot of medical implications, immediate and later in the future. Most of these children, they have these, they suffer from certain forms of anxiety.
You know, Dr. Noble, sorry to cut you. We'll come back. We'll come to that. Hold your thought. I hope you don't lose it. I'm trying to push this in so that before we start talking about what these would mean to that child in the future. Listening to you, some of the key things you've pointed out would mean for those who have been abused, almost around that point in time. What about those who have been abused and they've been silent and it took them years, weeks, a month to come up and say, this has actually been going on? I doubt if some of those telltale signs will still be there for people to see. So how can we, more or less identify, such people that have suffered abuses, over time?
Okay, for cases in this scenario you explained, we can see these children withdrawn. An adult is coming around them, they are getting withdrawn. They are not willing to interact. They are laid back. That is one. Secondly, these children struggle with academics. they find it difficult. We call it failure to thrive. They find it difficult matching up with their peers. It's not because they are not intelligent, but there is an impairment, there is an abuse that has lingered and that has made them predisposed to having this. So apart from that, some of them, you've noticed that they have low self-esteem. A child that was doing well in school before suddenly starts dropping in grades and all that. It's a cause of alarm. It's a cause of alarm. Then for others that have taken so long to actually talk about this, maybe for reasons like ranging from maybe they won't believe them and stuff like that, a large percentage of them just have, we call it a social mismatch. They just can't blend with the society. They are laid back in a certain way. Like I said earlier, however, there is no investigation, there is no medical testing to actually show how long this has gone or at what point it started. However, these signs can point to an abuse in the past or an ongoing abuse. You realize that they are just laid back.
Let me quickly bring in Aminata Koroma. She joins us now. Aminata Koroma, many thanks for finding time to join us on this very important talk today on VSA. Well, looks like Aminata is having some problems with connecting to us, and as soon as that is sorted out, we'll bring in Aminata Koroma. Back to you, Dr. Allen Nobles. Some of the key things you were talking about, you were going to tell us about what future problems some of these people go through having been abused, in times past.
Okay, thank you. In most cases, we realize and we see a decline in their activities. Let me go further. Let me explain better. We realize that they have post-traumatic stress syndromes. They have flashbacks. They keep seeing this past event like a daily reoccurrence. There are some events that trigger the past events. So that is for post-traumatic stress syndrome. Then they also suffer from anxiety. They may just be anxious for no reason. So these are one of the most debilitating complications later on. Then we also find out that that depressed ability to talk for a very long period of time, it also reflects to their own children. Cases show that most people that have been abused tend to transfer such abuse in a similar form or an unrelated form to their own children or the people that stay with them. So like I said, it doesn't have to be narrowed down to sexual abuse. We have a lot more. It can be neglect in various forms. It can be emotional violence. It can be sexual. But I just want to narrow it down to the sexual part. So we tend to see where these victims go on the long run and also inflict similar abuse to their children. So, but it's not in all cases. However, the most predominant complications or long-term effects of abuse is usually post-traumatic stress syndrome and anxiety in most cases. So, if we can have a way that these people speak up on time, we'll realize that we'll cut down on the number of cases we have of such occurrences.
Speaking out and speaking up is very important here, as highlighted by you, and it can only help, in solving this, problem. Is there a need for child panels? Now we're talking about people who listen to cases of children only.
Of course. Like I said, if you have a child that is old enough to speak up, if the child tells you, oh, I was hurt by so and so person, or I was hurt by so and so person, best believe that we are hurt by those persons or people involved. So if If there can be a role of a panel, of course, yes. We need to hear them out. Provided that child is of an age to speak, it should be looked into, it should be investigated, and it should be prosecuted if deemed fit and if culpable.
Let me see if Aminata Kuruma is back. Can you hear me now, Aminata?
Yes, I can hear you.
Well, I'm excited as well. Good to have you join us. This very important topic, which also is something that you have been so interested in working on. There are people, adults now, who carried incidents of abuse for so long. Many of them were abused as children, and they seem to cover it. How can one, as a parent, help these people?
Yeah, well, basically, most times you find out that the violation you get is within the home. And so, the best way we can look at that is to be watchful of the children so that they don't get the abuse in the home.
Are there cases, you're handling in your, group at the moment in Sierra Leone? Perhaps you want to, give us some kind of lessons from your experience in Sierra Leone.
Most recent case, we have fought so hard, they were not able to get justice. It's the 5-year-old Khadija Sapor was abused in the home, allegedly by a cousin. This case went as far as the court. The people they suspect were remanded. But later, the case has died down. The victim has been released. So for us, justice is one key thing that we are struggling with. Yeah.
Well, I think, Dr. Kuruma, this particular issue was dealt with earlier when we had Anne Yvonne Benson Idahosa, both of whom we spoke to earlier on. And they did say, irrespective of the status of people, perpetrators, still justice can be done and be seen to be done. But in this case that you just highlighted, this very influential person is off the hook, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the suspect was the two suspects were in prison for about 7 years. But later we got information that they are not guilty. And so for now, we don't even know what is happening. But it will interest you to know that this sexual assault in the increase. When you think of, we have 5 Rainbow Initiative Centers. This Rainbow Initiative was set up to look at victims of sexual gender-based violence. From January to December 2020, we had about 3,389 cases of sexual assault of different categories, more of children. And it is surprising to find out that out of this, it's only 367 were sent to court, and out of the 367, it's only 132 that were prosecuted. So you can just imagine, of 3,000, more than 3,000, we have only 132 to see. Simply because people don't trust the justice system.
Well, no doubt the figures aren't encouraging, no doubt. But quickly, as we wind down, let me bring in Dr. Nobles here quickly. Let's see how we can wrap up with this. Is there a way, cases of abuse can be medically established even after a long time? For instance, we've seen the documentary of people giving, their accounts of encounter with the music star in the United States, R. Kelly. How can these cases be medically established against, perpetrators?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that. How can the perpetrators do what?
How can medically, now speaking, cases of abuse be established against perpetrators even after a long time?
Like I said, in cases of, I'll use physical abuse because that's where we get to see more clinical evidences. There's a long-term pattern. You see patterns of broken bones that have healed over time. You see bruises that are resolving. You may see evidence of physical trauma in cases of sexual assault to the genital areas and to the anal areas. So those can be pointers as evidence to help the law in getting a hold of these perpetrators, because those evidences can't lie. You can't make them up. You can't make up a broken bone that's healed. So that's just an example. Broken bones, physical evidences of trauma to the genital areas and to the anal areas. So those are should I say evidences. You can see areas of a healed scar in areas that shouldn't be. I'm seeing a toddler. Maybe the baby is 9 months old, and I'm seeing a deep cut on the back. And you're telling me this baby inflicted the cut on herself or himself. It's unrelated. It's not feasible at all. So when we see things like that, things that are out of the ordinary, then they can be pointers to abuse.
Well, no doubt, I think it's something that we really should stay on because the ultimate solution to battling child abuse is in communities, and it starts from the family. Listen to all of you. Parents must look after their children and interact with them as much as possible, keeping in mind some of these telltale signs you've all established. Better relationships make communication easier, and let children be children. So watch your children, help them in watching their backs too. So it's a fine place to stop on the show today. Many thanks for being such nice company, Dr. Noble, and of course Aminata Koroma. Well, the program returns again tomorrow. Bye-bye.